Hi, good afternoon. A warm welcome to our participants to the third International Conference on Cordillera Studies. So this is our second day. So we're happy that you're here with us to join us. We have a total of 20 plus participants for this session. I am Rosel Balmores Paulino, a faculty in the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and Psychology, College of Social Sciences, University of the Philippines, Baguio, and I will be your moderator for this panel session. The University of the Philippines, Baguio, through its Cordillera Studies Center, held the first international conference on Cordillera Studies on February 7 to 9, 2008 in Baguio City. The 2008 conference addressed the general theme of Indigenous peoples and local communities in transition. The second international conference on Cordillera Studies was held on July 12 to 14, 2017 at Cap Jan Hay Trade and Cultural Center, Baguio City. And the general theme at that time was on Indigenous studies in the Philippines, issues and prospects. So for this year, the conference with the general theme of Indigenous peoples and the Sustainable Development Goals will provide a venue for participants to present and discuss experiences, opportunities, and challenges in the attainment of SDGs in the Cordillera region of Northern Luzon and other Indigenous communities elsewhere in the Philippines and the world. All right. So the conference began last July 5. Today is the second day of the conference, and the two remaining days will be on July 19 and 26. If you notice, nag-change po yung ating title for the panel. Instead of Indigenous Identity and Values in Contemporary Contexts, nagbago lang po ng kaunti yung title, no? It's now Indigenous Identity and Representation in Contemporary Media. So unfortunately, two of our speakers were not able to join us, no? So we had the conference organizers need to make some adjustments, no? But still, we're fortunate to be able to listen, no, to our two presenters. Ayan po. So now, kung may tanong na po kayo, you can actually type them out already in the chat box, and then immediately after the presentations, we will try to address your questions or comments. Yan po. Okay, so again, welcome to panel 15. So let's now begin, and as I've said, I don't know if I've said it already, no, but we have two presenters, and let me just check kung nandito po sila ngayon. No? Parang nakita ko na silang pumasok. So we would like to acknowledge two of the two presenters, and these are Miss Sulit, Christine Camille Sulit. Andyan po si Miss Sulit. Nakita ko na siya kanina, right?
Yes po, good afternoon po.
Hi, good afternoon. And of course, our second presenter will be Mr. Peter Dalokdok Jr. Ayan, sir, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, good afternoon. All right, so now let's begin, no, the presentations. So before that, let us have an idea, no, kung mas makilala pa natin, no, ng lubos ang ating mga presenters. All right, so our first presenter is a film and mass media instructor at Far Eastern University and CIIT College of Arts and Technology. She was part of the 16th Ricky Lee Scriptwriting Workshop in 2017. She also served as Deputy Festival Director for the 2018 Quezon City International Pink Film Festival. She's currently finishing her MA at Media Studies, focuses on film at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. With her paper entitled Cinema as Cultural Weapon, a case study on Ganab de Anos and the application of the theory of fourth cinema, please join me in welcoming Ms. Christine Camille Sulit.
Good morning, everyone. This is Christine Camille Sulit, and I will be presenting my paper, Cinema as Cultural Weapon, a case study on Ganab de Anos and the application of the theory of fourth cinema. The word irony best suits the events experienced by the ITAs in the recent Southeast Asian Games or SEA Games last 2019. From the opening to the end of Games, the organizers of the program did not miss to show the culture of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines, primarily their attire, songs, and dances. While the event highlighted their culture, one of the highlighted groups, the Aitas themselves, have suffered at the hands of Bases Conversion and Development Authority, the agency behind the construction of New Clark City, where the SEA Games transpired. The BCDA did not recognize Aita's ownership of the land now occupied by New Clark City. This clearly violates free, prior, and informed consent, a right granted to indigenous groups. Through this, they can consent or refuse projects that will affect them, specifically their ancestral land. This would have been the first level of protection against the exploitations of institutions outside of their group. The Philippine media is also complicit in not valuing free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples groups. In films like Igorota of Luis Nepomuceno, the display of Charito Solis's breasts only served as the film's primary spectacle. The film failed to explore the culture of the Bontoc Igorot that resulted in such a practice of showing it. This film also drew protest from the Igorots because the film did not properly portray what an Igorota is. Practices such as production of films about their ancestral lands to matters of representation in ethno-linguistic groups are continuously being questioned by film and media scholars and the indigenous groups themselves. The issues surrounding the creation of films regarding ethno-linguistic groups will be attempted to be addressed by this paper by testing Barry Barclay's Fort Cinema theory to a selected film created by Bayakan Kanae. It tried to explore on how being a part of an ethno-linguistic group affects the type of narrative and aesthetics seen in the film and the type of representation of the said group exhibited by the film. This analysis sought to see if the standards of Fort Cinema are applicable to this film, and if not, what concepts outside of the theory we can utilize to make it more appropriate in the style of filmmaking of the ethno-linguistic groups in the country. One of the biggest shows of ABS-CBN last 2018 became controversial with the usage of the word Bagani as the title of their series. The word Bagani for Lumad culture means warrior. The word is sacred and it is not just given to anyone. The issue of Bagani erupted on various social networking sites and resulted in an in-depth discourse on cultural appropriation of indigenous words in popular culture, such as in teleseries. One commissioner of Commission on Higher Education, Ronald Adamat, questioned how the specific word ended up in a corporation like ABS-CBN. The dismal state of literary education in the country is one of the culprits as to why most people are not even familiar with the word Bagani. There are attempts to address the lack of the national government through literary works in the field of popular culture such as Edgar Samaria's Janus Silang. This adaptation to popular culture is essential to recognize diverse aspects and layers of our national identity. Gracio adds that Bagani is not just present in the lexicon of the Lumad, but it is also present in other Visayan language. This incident is an example of what types of issues regarding the misrepresentation of indigenous peoples group in our country. They are present in various forms of media over time. Early photographs and film of the native Filipinos became the main basis for Americans to prey on their new property. In displaying Filipinos and photography and power in the colonial Philippines, the new conqueror exhibited photography to further elevate their distinction with the Filipino people, particularly among indigenous groups. In photographs of American soldiers, they showcased the face of the new colony and the people occupying the land. American occupation in the Philippines. The photographs he took of the indigenous groups presented the idea that the Filipinos were not yet civilized and needed the Americans to save them. Mercer utilized various styles of photography to further prove these claims. By placing an American soldier to an Igorot side to side on the photographs, their physical differences can easily be spotted, from their way of clothing or lack thereof, skin color, height, stature, etc. This visual representation painted the indigenous people in the country as someone who needed to adapt to the colonizer in order for them to be civilized just like their neighbors in the pictures. Even a documentary created by Worcester entitled Native Life in the Philippines reflected how Americans view indigenous peoples group in the country. The use of wide shots enforced the Americans' judgmental observation of indigenous groups, depicting naked women while picking lies from other women, worshipping their anito, demonstrating their culture through dances and costumes. There is an explicit purpose to using the media to assert their power. This proves that these images and films were not really innocent in shaping the representation of indigenous people during the time of occupation. With the liberation of the Philippines, from the shackles of colonialism, various discriminatory practices against ethno-linguistic groups are still evident. In this case, it is no longer the foreigners who primarily shape the representation of these groups, but the local mainstream media, in whatever form it may be. Film, documentaries in particular, is one of the means of witnessing new perspectives and narratives, including the stories of ethno-linguistic groups. For nearly 100 years of documentary in the country, there have been several television and film documentaries that have showcased the narratives of these groups. Can it be said that the documentary gave these groups due recognition and representation, or did it just continue to intensify the prevailing ideology about them? Hemala explored in Zooming In, Representation and Resistance, an analysis of the representation of Aitas in Zubik Sapari and Buhay Aita, the methods of a television documentary in framing the life of the Aita. Buhay Aita is an episode of the program Mag-TV Tayo Atin To, which aired in 2008. A part of the documentary is the performance of the traditional Aita dances. Through point of view shots, it can be noticed that the Aita seem to be just performing to the cameras instead of doing it for a ritual or celebration for their own community. She criticized the presentation because the program seemed to remove these dances from its appropriate context, similar to what Worcester did a century ago, in putting a white backdrop on indigenous groups to keep them separate from their homes. For Himala, the program became a tool to exoticize the Aitas. She identified several practices in the documentary that proves this argument. The repeated mention of their physical characteristics, the disrespect for their sacred practice of dance, in creating the persona of the Aita as a group unable to stand on their feet after the Pinatubo blast. In imaging the Igorot in vernacular films produced in the Cordillera, Rutin Dan examined films made by mainstream companies about the Igorots. Using the framework of Shohat and Stam, there are two methods to examine the films produced by countries belonging to the Third World, that is, infantilization and animalization. According to Tindaan, the consciousness of the colonial subject, in this case the relationship of the lowlander to the highlanders, is considered passive or at a low level in the process of infantilization. This was seen in Joel Lamangan's film Sabel. The Ibalay community needed the presence of an outsider in the person of Tony, Sunshine Dizon, to defend them against a mining company who planned to grab their ancestral lands. Even in Don't Give Up on Us by Bernal, 2006, Vince is presented as someone who cannot reach the lifestyle of Abby because he is from Banawe and Abby is used to the fast-paced world in Manila. Animalization, on the other hand, is a manifestation of the animalistic nature of indigenous groups that should be kept to a minimum. In the studies mentioned, from the period of colonialism to the present time, misrepresentation among indigenous groups in the country is still prevalent. It seems that the mainstream film producers are still naive of collective experiences and narratives of these groups, that they only manage to present one-dimensional storylines and characterizations. If this is the dominant discourse of major media outfits on how to showcase the identity of ethno-linguistic groups, is there still a chance for these communities to reclaim their identity in film? Fourth, cinema as a theory and practice. The creation of indigenous films for indigenous peoples. This is what Barry Barclay emphasizes to correct the misconceptions of the general audience of such groups. It serves as an avenue to oppose the three main methods of filmmaking. First, the first cinema or the films made in Hollywood. The second cinema or the art films created by filmmakers in Europe. And third cinema or films from countries with developing status. The establishment of Fort Cinema has also been a part of a comprehensive campaign to promote indigenous media. It is the method of using various forms of media to affirm their identity contrary to what Western nations have defined them. The 70s were instrumental in how Barclay shaped the theory. In various protests by indigenous peoples groups around the World Council for Indigenous Peoples was formed in 1975. Along with the movement at the international level of indigenous groups, the Maori, the ethno-linguistic group to which Barclay belongs in New Zealand, made waves in order for their appeals to be heard on the national scale. Some of their pleas pertain to the defense of their ancestral lands and their rights for self-determination. This pushed Barclay to start the practice of filmmaking with a particular focus on the narratives of the Maori. Barclay's development of Fort Cinema also marked the similarity of the struggles of indigenous groups, not only in New Zealand but also around the world as demonstrated in the actions of indigenous peoples from the national to international arena from the 1970s onwards. He believed that every indigenous group in any part of the world has a shared narrative of violence from colonial or imperialist forces. The politics of Fort Cinema. According to Barclay, by displaying their identity as a Maori or as indigenous is a political act in itself. The filmmaker must be aware that its viewers can empathize with the identity they are presenting on the screen. The politics of indigenous films can also be manifested by depicting the habits or actions of indigenous peoples, which are often not portrayed in the industrial mode of filmmaking. Their daily life, ritual, public and private interactions of these people must primarily be shown in these films. Even the narrative and the rhythm of the films are also political for Barclay. He added that indigenous films do not have to follow the traditional rhythm or narrative provided by the capitalist film industry. The connection must also be made that even in the personal narrative of an indigenous person, one must look at the political factors that affect the course of their lives. Giving face to the identity of the indigenous people is still an ongoing question that indigenous film production continuously encounters. The framework given by Barclay is a big step to aid filmmakers to be in the ideal direction in producing indigenous people's films. If these are the standards of Fort Cinema, to say that films are created by indigenous people are political and valid. Can it be seen in films created by indigenous peoples in the country? If it cannot be seen, can these movies still be considered as Fort Cinema? The application of Fort Cinema to Ganap de Anos. The introduction of digital format in filmmaking as one of the most important technological changes in cinema paved the way for the emergence of the narratives of indigenous peoples group in the country. Now, individual filmmakers and film collectives had the opportunity to create films which did not require the approval of mainstream companies, which was maximized by Nestor Clemente's film production. The full-length film, Ganap de Anos, or The Price of Perseverance, was created by the team of Nestor Clemente, Akan Kanae in 2009. This will be the site of examination to assess whether it conforms to the criteria given by Barclay in Fort Cinema. This is just one of the films created by the Igorots themselves that started in 1992. With the acceleration of production from analog to digital, some members of indigenous peoples groups were able to share their stories in the medium of film. One of the questions that can launch the analysis towards this film is also a question that Barclay asked in his book, Our Own Image. How can we take this maverick, yet fond friend of ours, the camera, into the Maori community and be confident it will act with dignity? Ganap de Ano's plot revolves around the life of cousins Wally and Tipak, which is a true-to-life story. They stopped studying because of the bullying they received from their classmates, and then the two decided to go gardening instead of continuing their academics. As they got older, they maintained their jobs at the Kada and they did not look for another job outside of it. In the Kada, the cousins will meet Lot Loti, a young woman who just started working there too. The woman was fascinated with the perseverance that the two have for their work, and their response is they haven't finished school. The film was a channel for the audiences to witness their efforts until they reach the comfort of life that they have dreamed about, having personal properties, cars, business, and a joyous family life. At the end of the film, they highlighted that education is still important, and if they can go back to their youth, they will likely go back to their studies. They did not regret the decision they made, but they saw the value of the ability to read, write, and count in everyday situations. If we are to look at Barclay's standards of Fort Cinema, one can see the similarity of the films to the requirements presented in the theory. Clemente clearly introduced the life of the Kankanee. In the early parts of the film, it already showed images attached to agriculture in the highlands, one of the prominent identities of the Ecuador. Through extreme long shots, views of the rice terraces were introduced to familiarize the viewer with the venue of the milieu. Even the traditional houses of theirs are included alongside the images connected with agriculture. It is during these moments where the film flaunts its identity as indigenous. Clemente also used subtitles to introduce landmarks and other significant items associated with their place. By this, we now recognize that the potatoes that come out in the film are not just potatoes. They also share an identity with the Igorots. Even the actors who performed in the film and the staff who would work on it were ensured by Clemente as Igorot. For Nestor Clemente and Paulino, the Igorot filmmakers I interviewed, there are two reasons they hired these artists. First is to make sure the performance of their characters in the film authentic. Second, for practical reasons because they were certain that it is much cheaper to hire a non-actor compared to an established one. Regional filmmakers have their own rhythm and methodology in capturing their locals and narratives. As the film progresses, the film's adherence to the rhythm of agriculture is remarkable. Gardening or kada has become a central element of the film because it is the chosen career of the protagonist. The bulk of the film scenes take place on the fields and mountains, and the vegetable patch where the two work. The day-to-day work of Wally and Tipak may not be as attractive when viewed by mainstream film standards because it is a slow process. A lot of the scenes in the film showcase them plowing the soil, watering the plants, sprinkling fertilizers on the crops, and talking to clients at the training post. The film did not use fast editing cuts to cut time, but instead we see the proper process and time allotted to their work. As the film's main audience is Cordillera, it steps on Barclay's argument that indigenous groups can fully appreciate and recognize what they will witness in this film. Although this is not a highlight in Ganap de Anos, the filmmakers also use original songs by Igorot singers and musicians that apply to what is happening in the scene. In a scene where Tipak is about to drop vegetables in a trading post, one could hear a song that describes the process of this business. According to Clemente and Paulino, the application of this specific song to their film is intentional. This is to remind the people to have a strong connection with their daily activities in order for them to never forget. This is exactly what Barclay expressed in films like this. Ganap de Anos is a bridge that connects the viewers on what is happening in the daily lives of the Igorots. It can also be used as a weapon to dispel stereotypes about the work of indigenous peoples groups, which are easily thrown at them by mainstream media. To support Barclay's argument, the dissatisfaction with repeated misrepresentation towards the Igorot in the media became the driving force behind Clemente and Paulino to produce the film. An outstanding feat of the film is that even if Wally and Tipak did not undergo formal education, they are not presented as useless in the film. They use their labor force so that they could achieve their dreams in life. They are aware of their lack of knowledge and they sought a solution to their problem by asking a Dukil to read letters for them. The film avoided representing Devitism because it showcased the logical process of the cousins in solving their problems. Everything mentioned in the analysis of Ganap de Ano serves as an indication that it conforms to the standards of Fort cinema. There is no denying in what Barkley said that the experience of every indigenous peoples group in the world that appeared in the film is similar. The entirety of Ganap de Anos has been used as a medium to exhibit their culture, practices, and narratives that are impossible to be observed in the mainstream media. The film's voice was clear in reversing the mainstream representation of them. Despite this, a question still remains. What kind of politics does the film want to convey to respond to one of Fort Cinema's demands? Reconstruction of the Fort Cinema from the Igorot filmmaking experience.
The cousin's decision to stop studying is, I would say, a political imposition of the film. According to Clemente, it is not that education is not important for the Cancanais or the Igorot in general, but through the film they were able to show the reality on ground that farming can be chosen as a profession too. For him, it is a noble form of income, just like any other work. Even the answer of Wally and Tipak's teacher in their decision to stop is very different from what we usually see in the fashion of formal education in the country. The teacher fully accepted the decision of the two and only reminded them that they can still go back to school if they wish. The teacher's answer is an indication that perhaps this system has existed among the Igorot for a long time because they are open to gardening as an alternative career for them. As the film progressed, the decision to skip school became a debate for Wali and Tipak. The two knew the hardships they faced in their lives due to lack of formal education, yet they also recognized the fruit of their labor and technical know-how in terms of farming. The portrayal of politics may not be explicit in the film, But the narrative and the production of the film itself aligns with what Barclay believed to be a political act. Raising the story of being a successful person in the field of agriculture in your own community is a direct hit towards the problems posed by the K-12 program, which promotes an import-oriented and export-dependent view of our workforce. The film provides a new lens on how we can see the agricultural industry within our own country. With this triumph, this is also where the film's shortcomings can be seen. Not to mention the country's various agricultural problems such as lack of budget from the national government, the conversion of farmlands into factories and subdivisions, the killing of peasant organizers, child labor, and low regard in this field. On the whole, this is the reversal the film has made on Barclay's given standard for Fort cinema. We cannot say that it is not political because the making of the film itself, despite the lack of funding and filming equipment, support from local and national governments, is a testament to the struggle of indigenous peoples to make their voices heard through new mediums such as films. To conclude, the contribution of Ganap de Anos is an important addition to the existing body of knowledge to further highlight the identity and the history of the Igorot. In analyzing the film, the political issue of the Igorot self-determination is not only seen in the traditional presentation of the struggles of the colonial and neoliberal forces, but also in their daily decision-making in their lives and authentic display of their livelihood, culture, and tradition. Simplistic at first glance, but this assertion is the heart of Fort Cinema. It is the indigenous, from the indigenous, and for the indigenous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sulit. We will be entertaining your questions after the second presentation. So, kung may naisip na po kayong tanong, feel free to use the chat box. Right, let's now move on to our second presentation. Right, so our second presenter is a faculty member at the Department of Humanities, College of Arts and Sciences, at the Benguet State University. He teaches communication courses both in the graduate and the undergraduate level. With his paper titled Benguet Kankanaey Identity Constructions in Local Films in Cordillera, Philippines. Okay, let us please help me welcome Mr. Peter Dalokdok Jr.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. For this presentation, I'll be presenting the result of my study entitled Benguet Kankanay Identity Constructions in Local Films in Benguet, Cordillera. All right, a brief introduction about this paper. Cultural identity, I borrowed the definition from Woodward and Fishman in 1997 and 1999, which means belonging to a certain groups influenced by political, economic, psychological, and cultural interaction. Further, according to Ibrahim Thurer, it is how a person presents himself. In this context, what have we become in this age of globalization? So what does it mean to be a member of a certain cultural group? In this sense, what does it mean to become a kankanay in this modern society or in these modern times? I also embarked with some media misrepresentations about the Igorots where the kankanay is a subgroup. According to Fong in 2007, mainstream media would say Igorots are exotic beings. Further, in Tindaan in 2010, noted that mainstream media described the Igorots or they associated with the Igorots with the terms animalization and infantilization. So in this study, learning the culture of the local communities give individuals clear understanding of what is relevant to these communities that can aid in strengthening development initiatives or creating communication programs or what development plans so that these plans are aligned with what are the important things that these communities consider. And further, it provides a deeper understanding of the culture or Kankanay cultural identity and makes sense of who the Kankanay are in the current context. It will also help those who are struggling with their cultural identity to identify themselves and find where they really belong. And this is a response also to stereotypes and give a clearer perspective on who the Igorots, particularly the Benguet Kankanai, are in modernity. In this study, I delved into the profile and of the local film production in terms of history, genre, and challenges encountered in movie production. Further, I determined the cultural identity constructs reflected in the films. All right. So to do this, I made use of literature review and content with thematic analysis. Okay. For the profile of the respondents in this interview, we have selected individuals from the Kankaray-speaking municipalities of Benguet. We have Bacon, um, Anghayan, Kibungan, parts of Kapangan because Kapangan, the same as Atok ay multilingual, meaning or they speak two local languages, Kankanay and Ibaloy. Right. All right, brief history of the local film industry. It can be credited to Sami Dangpa, who founded the vernacular video ministry in 1992. From the name alone, vernacular, wherein films are or films produced use the word local language, and the theme centered on how Igorots face modern living. Films were initially screened in churches and during community events. So church-related themes like faith in God would always be the theme in these films. And other production houses were established. We have Indigenous Film Production in 2007. We have Talaw Sandang Production in 2007 also. Igorot Films in 2011, and other local production houses followed years after. The sources of stories in these local films are personal experiences and observations. According to our respondents, particularly Rosendo Sandong Salvacio, one of the prominent producers of local films, he would adapt the plot from or the story, the concept from American films, but would contextualize it to fit the Igorot or the Kankanaey situation. And the common genre are drama and romance. Because budget, it's cheaper to produce drama and romance as compared to other film genre. And the Sendong and other film directors also note that drama and romance are the reflections of people's experiences. All right, challenges in movie production also. In terms of production, we have lack of funding because they don't have much money for to create a studio type produced films. They just do trial and error, and they also lack formal training. They say that the Film Development Council is or are conducting film or trainings, but they focus more on theories, and our local film producers would want to do hands-on training on how to produce films. We also have circulation, the prevalence of piracy here in our locality hinders them from gaining money. And further, the influx of foreign films, where our respondents noted that the young ones would prefer foreign films over the local ones. And the easy access to mainstream entertainment for cable TV and satellite TV, since we have free entertainment, the locals don't buy CDs anymore. And legislation. They say that no local policy on piracy is developed here in our province. They went as far as Optical Media Board to seek for help and to protect their films from piracy, but they were told that these local films are like homemade products, quote and unquote, that the protection of these products are already in the hands of the local government unit. In terms of compensation, local film producers find it difficult to sustain movie production because, as we have noted earlier, there is a problem with circulation and they don't get much. They don't pocket much from their films. They even spend more from production and they cannot take it back from the sales of the films. But according to Sendong, the success when we ask them about the success, how do they rate their success in terms of film production? It's not actually how much they gain from the films, but it is how they help those people who are struggling in terms of finances, especially those who are undergoing hospitalizations. Because when they do concerts for cause, they charge an amount from the locals and they don't get a share from the amount that they collect. All those amounts that are collected in their concerts for a cause would go to their beneficiaries. For them, if I may quote him, he says that we are happy that the poor are helping the poor. We have here the cultural identity themes reflected in the movies. All right, we have the use of the Kankanay language. And the use of other languages also. In this picture, you can see here, um, it's a bar wherein um, singers wear white hats and also belts and the boots. And the language of their songs are in Kankanaay. We have the Kankanaay country, as they say. These are adapted from English country or the Western country, wherein they use the tune, but they translated the lyrics into the Kankanaay language. So apart from the Kankanaay language that they use for music, they also use the English language. And further, in this picture, we see the tongtong wherein um, if you have disputes in the community, the elders would go to the barangay and settle it, and they use the Kankanay language. And apart from the Kankanay language, they also use the Ilocano language. As they say, Ilocano is also the language of the North. Notably, in one of the films, there is a scene wherein a man wrote a letter to a lady, and they used the Kankanay language also. Aside from language, we have familiarity with the Kankanay traditional practices and legends. During the interviews, it was noted that the young ones or the younger generations are familiar with the cultural dances and practices, but some of them don't know how to dance the tayaw. But for the adults, they know how to do it. In terms of faith and religion, we can see here the transition from the traditional religion to Christianity. In this film, we can see a child where they're paying him over and for baby dedication as part of a religious rite. Okay. We also have here the food preference that people or here in the Kankanais would eat pikan, which is very common, and they also eat or sometimes eat with their bare hands, wherein a fork is not necessary. We have the term the cowboy. We should not be choosy that we use whatever we have. Notably, we also have migration as presented in the films wherein locals would go to La Trinidad in Baguio to continue their higher education and of course to look or to search for a living because there are no other sources of income in the provinces. These locals would move to the urban for employment. In this case, these two guys are from Asin and went to another place to work for someone because they left their place because they don't have source of income in their locality. We also have family ties. We have a different way of showing our family ties. We have praying together, and aside from eating together as a family. In this picture, the caption says, "Don't forget to pray to God," because the eldest son um, was asking permission from the parents to leave his community and go to another place in search um, for job or source of living, which is a manifestation of the earlier theme, which I presented, the migration. Okay, in the value of education, it shows that the Kankanai also look at education as something that is very important. The first scene shows a guy who left the lady she loves because he wants to pursue his education. The second picture shows a teacher who went to his pupil's house a day before he got absent because he would just want to check why the student get absent. It shows that the Kankanai also give value to education, that this is the only tawid, quote and unquote, or pamana that they can give to their children. All right. Further, in an interesting part of some of the movies also show how education, not just as a source or education would give you a better source of income, but also education allows you to go any place and you have wider perspectives. These two guys say that when they were speaking with their siblings and nephews, they say that gardening or agriculture is hard. This is what we get from not going to school. What they're pointing out is that gardening is not bad at all, but what they're trying to say is that if you are educated, you have more options, you have a wider understanding, and you can go to places you want to be. You can read the English language, or you can understand the English language and other languages. It means education opens up to opportunities. Also for the gender role orientation, notably, both the male and female do same tasks. There are no specific tasks for female and there are no specific tasks for men. What you can see here is a lady doing the cerrado or tending to the plants. So both tasks are done by both male and the female. We have love relationship and marriage. When we went through all of these films, we uh, we observed that all the dating scenes are shoot in, let's say, mountains, gardens. And when we asked the directors why did they do this or what's their inspiration for doing such, they say that they equate love with nature. That is why all scenes that would touch love are shoot outside. There. And for love, relationship, and marriage, usually these are or all are or most are solemnized by the church. And then issues on infidelity are also present, just like common marriages. We have here also the relationship and marriage would all usually start with the communications like text messages and Facebook chats now. And the social values, okay. We have here some themes that came out: responsibility, patience, diligence, generosity, respect for elders, faithfulness, justice, fidelity, social responsibility, loyalty, and the Bayanihan spirit. All right, in the picture we have here, in the caption it says, now that you have your money, think wisely where you spend it, because the story of the guy is after harvest, was given uh, his share from the service, and it was handed to them by his boss. Right. Just a summary of the cultural identity themes. We have use of Kankanai language, use of other languages, language preference, familiarity with Kankanai traditional practices and legends. If I may add, with the familiarity with Kankanai traditional practices and legends, some have already embraced the modern religion or Christianity, and some are still clinging with the traditional religion. And then there are groups who are also in between. We have why in between because of social assurance that if Christianity will not work, traditional religion will work. So they are or the same, if traditional religion will not work, Christianity will do. The same also with faith and religion. We also have food preference, we have migration, family ties, and social values. Let me just add also with I've um, missed to mention earlier with what section is that? Love relationship and marriage, I'm sorry, I think I was able to, I did not include that part in this summary. But if you are going to take a look at, or in that sense, the concept of dating, if you are going to compare it with the others, they go to the restaurants, right? But for the locals, they would prefer walking along mountains, going to the gardens, and others. We have also the value of education and then the gender role orientation. Oh, I'm sorry. Love relationship and marriage came last. All right. For the findings of the study, a closer look at the cultural identity themes unearthed from selected films and validated by movie consumers give us a vivid construction of the present-day Kankana identity. The local movies have responded to negative portrayals of Philippine mainstream media and presented themselves as individuals with aspirations and intellectual faculty. Infantilization and animalization, as earlier cited, is nowhere to be found. They are not exotic beings, but are civilized societies also. The movies produced by mainstream films would also need to do further research so that they would have a better representations of the communities that they intend to represent. Right. The Kankanai indigenous films are a rich repository of cultural identities that best describe the present-day Kankanai identity. These products describe their aspirations and other issues that matter most to the Kankanai communities and are profound examples of cultural representations. Okay. Right. For some conclusions and recommendations, the local film production serves as an avenue for passionate filmmakers to be recognized, practice their crafts, and learn more skills as they produce more films. But like any other industry, they face challenges that until now are not yet resolved. Okay, the films produce the common discourses in Kankanai communities inspired by the historical past. Right. Okay. Recommendations in terms of the challenges, new and innovative marketing ideas should be developed that suit to the demands and standards of the viewing public for them to successfully market the films. Partnership with local or other organizations and academic institutions could also be an options. And the LGU, through participatory communication approach, should draft a policy to address the problems troubling the local film industry. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Sulit and Mr. Dalokdo, all right, for those for those presentations. Before we move on to the Q&A, just a quick summary, no? So para mas ma-refresh lang siguro yung ating memories, no, sa nabigay na presentation. You will notice that for both presentations, they focus on Philippine media. They focus on the importance, no, the influence of Philippine media, and how these how Philippine media can actually be used to reinforce, no, certain identities, particularly indigenous as well as ethno-linguistic identities, no, as represented in Philippine media. Unfortunately, no, lumalabas sa parehong presentation na merong mga shortcomings, no, ang Philippine media. For instance, no, yung lumalabas na theme dito is yung misrepresentation, no, of identity. Right now, for the first presentation, no, just a quick summary based on how my own take-home points, no, from the presentation. One is that yung nabanggit na kanina that there's a misrepresentation of particular ethno-linguistic groups in Philippine media, and that it questions, no, on how these previous films came up, we know, with these representations, and that is of course a challenge, no. And that's why for the first paper, no, our author, our presenter, argued that the fourth cinema, no, as a way to understand film, no, and the extent to which they can fully represent, no, specific indigenous groups or ethno-linguistic groups, no, yun yung isa sa pinapakita ng paper, no, yung challenge na yun. And indeed, no, the application of the fourth cinema to particularly yung in-illustrate niya ito through the Gun of the Anos, no, pinakita niya dito that it is through fourth cinema, no, that could possibly link, no, the viewers to the daily lives of specific indigenous groups. It is a tool, a political tool to dispel stereotypes. Ayan, all right. So I'm sure marami pang tanong dyan, no? As for the second presentation, okay, dito naman nag-focus din, no, sa still, no, ang commonality nila of course is the use of film, no, as a tool to surface, for instance, in the second presentation, yung cultural identity, no, of Benguet Kankanay, no, their identity constructions in selected local films, no. And based on the presentation, we've listened to several themes that surfaced, no, from their analysis. Specifically, the basic question that this paper tried to answer is, what does it really mean, no, to be a Kankanay in this modern age, no? And ultimately, no, the goal is to surface what is it really, no, to be a Kankanay in this at this time, no, to also, no, at the same time dispel, no, stereotypes such as yung na-mention kanina, no, better representation ng goal, no, ng mga film na to, and not to reinforce again the idea of indigenous groups as being exotic beings. Ayan. Okay, so with that, I suppose we are now ready to listen. No, you can actually type your questions, or you can actually raise your hand so that we can also listen to your question. Okay, I think there's a private message here directed to the second presenter, Mr. Peter. Excuse me, Dalokdok. Okay, can you hear us? So ito po yung tanong niya.
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you.
So here's one question for you. Okay, so you mentioned now that the analysis was based on specific films, no? So the question is, ano yung basis for the selection? Ano yung naging scope ng selection ng film?
Yes, continue.
Excuse me.
Okay. For the basis of the selection of films, we went to pre-pandemic pa ito, no? So we went to what do you call this? Outlet stores in Baguio and even in Bugas, and asked them to list the most purchased titles of films. So we actually made a tally. So that was our basis. And also with the prevalence of the internet, the YouTube, pinili namin dito yung maraming views. So aside from the number of copies being purchased in outlet stores, we also based the films with the number of views on YouTube. And evidently, lumabas na yung medyo napopurchase din sa outlet stores, mas mataas din yung views sa YouTube. So yun yung dalawang basis namin sa pagpili ng films na na-analyze sa study.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that question and thank you for your answer, Mr. Dalokdok. So, pwede bang mag-follow up? So, a total of how many films yung na-cover nyo for this study?
Yes. For these films, I watched the 11 films.
11. All right. Okay. So, thank you. Any more question? Okay. So, pwede nyo rin pong i-direct message sa akin. Ako, as for me, no, nakita natin yung talagang very powerful, no, ang media, no, ang Philippine media. And on one hand, no, parang kumbaga it's a double-edged sword, no, dahil very powerful siya, no, yung matinding influence niya. On one hand, pwedeng gamitin to to reinforce, no, wrong or yung sabi nga misrepresentations. Yeah. But on the other hand, no, based on the presentation halimbawa of Miss Sulit, no, pinakita rin niya dito na merong way, no, to to turn it around, no, and make it work, no, for specific ethno-linguistics groups, halimbawa, no, mga indigenous groups. Alright? Okay. Pwede po kayo magtaas ng kamay. Sige, tingnan ko nga baka
If I may add some points pala sa aking presentation while waiting. Although this was asked also in terms of the LGBTQ community dito sa Benguet, no, acceptance. So, doon sa films ay wala pa naman. So I think that is one of the areas that has also to be studied dito sa Cordilleras. Pero dun sa scope ng aking study ay hindi pa nababanggit. So I think nung pinroduce yung film ay hindi pa ganun kataas yung clamor of LGBTQ acceptance masyado. So I think I'm encouraging other researchers most probably to do more research on this dito sa Cordillera context.
Okay, we now have a question. Ayan. Sent to me directly also. So I suppose, let's assume that this is for the both of you. Okay, let me read. If you have the choice, would you want these local movies to be shown in mainstream media? If yes, do you think there will be drawbacks? Ayan. Ulitin ko ba? O if you have the choice, would you want these local movies to be shown in mainstream media? So that's the first question. So if yes, do you think there will be drawbacks? Ayan. Okay, so maybe we can hear from Christine first, from Miss Sulit.
Right. Hello, can you hear me well? Okay naman po.
Yes naman, yes.
I really wanted sana the films to be shown then in mainstream media because I think they can. We have a lot of film festivals na rin po kasi around that showcases the life of indigenous people. Halimbawa, we have Cinema Region. So that's the premier film festivals talaga. Film festival for regional filmmakers, and I think pasok doon yung mga ginagawang films sa Cordillera. And then fun fact, yung Ganap de Anos po was actually a part of the finalists ng 2009 Cinema Region. So it was discovered by Sir Teddy Ko, and he was able to include that in the program. And I think nangangailangan na din po talaga ng mga ganong uri ng pelikula into our mainstream consciousness because ang dami na din po natin kasing options to look for stories. And I think maganda din na platform talaga na mailagay siya into mainstream media so that mas maitakda na din parang ganon yung identity of the indigenous peoples. And I hope, di ba, sa pamamaraan na pag-highlight, pag-mainstream sa kanila, fully na talaga na ma-dispel yung mga misconceptions about them.
So, the second aspect of the question from our audience is, do you think there will be drawbacks? Ayan. So, I guess your position, Ms. Sulit, is yes, no, magandang i-mainstream, no, itong mga film na to. But the second question is, if yes, do you think there will be drawbacks?
I think there will be because sadly, our indigenous people's history are not really fully incorporated or penetrated into our mainstream education system.
So parang there will always be comments about how a particular indigenous peoples groups will be portrayed in mainstream films or mainstream dramas. But I think by highlighting or mainstreaming them, at least nagkakaroon din tayo ng avenue talaga to fully tell them na, hello, ito po yung mga kwento, mga naratibo na for the longest time hindi natin alam kasi hindi sinasama sa ating formal education. Parang we know indigenous peoples just by their physical appearances but not their histories. And I think yung pagkukwento ng narratives, ng kasaysayan, nitong um, ng mga indigenous peoples groups talaga will at least put them into the pedestal na ito po yung kasama po ito no sa kasaysayan ng buong bansa. And kailangan hindi lang tayo nakikinig or nagsusubscribe into a monolithic um, formation of our Philippine history. So I think there will be drawbacks, but I think mas malaki po yung magiging opportunities, yung magiging possibilities by mainstreaming, highlighting their stories.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Sulit. All right, now let's listen to your response also, Mr. Dalokdok.
Yes, regarding the showing their films in the mainstream, I also asked the same to our film producers, and they said they're willing. Although one of their narrations say na they were offered that their films to be shown on cable TV, for instance, but their concern is how are we going to make money from the films because if it will be screened for free, there are no ways for them to compensate. Also, so ganong perspective, no? And I think one also the things that they pointed out is that they are aware that their films, in terms of quality, like the editing, they are aware that there needs much improvement, and they say that they have to do something to improve the quality of the films that they are going to show. So I think that is one of the drawbacks that needs to be addressed also if these films are also shown mainstream. But I would agree, as my fellow presenter has said, that showing these films to mainstream would be a good one also. And as noted, these films that we have reviewed, some of them are also presented in the Cinema Region, as noted earlier.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, dumadami yung tanong natin sa chat box. So, punta na tayo sa second. Is it possible for a member of an ethno-linguistic group to commit misappropriation on his or her own community? Example is one of the member of the boy band Alamat, excuse me, wherein the tattoos of warriors was used as a design in one of his costumes. And this is directed for both speakers.
Okay lang po ba? Mauna na po ako.
Yes, okay, sorry. Sige, Miss Sulit.
I think there will always be avenues talaga for us to make mistakes. And hindi lang naman siya for for filmmakers na doing narratives on indigenous people's narratives or stories, but also yung mga filmmakers din natin sa mga mainstream and independent. So I think laging magkakaroon talaga ng mistake. But then for me as a filmmaker din as well, process din siya talaga of doing research, of examining, being into the communities, no, for us talaga to have a better representation. And I think some of the cultural appropriations then being done by some of the members of the indigenous community, I think afflicted din naman siya no, by the mainstream companies, mainstream film or mainstream media companies. So ayun, it will always be there, but lagi naman tayong merong space then for us to learn and rectify our mistakes.
That's right. Okay. Thank you. All right, Mr. Dalokdok.
Yeah, sige. So let's say parang misrepresentation of the being represented. Ano? I think, yes, I agree with my fellow presenter. There are really times siguro na minsan sila na-romanticize din nila ng konti siguro, na-overlook din ng konti, which possible din na mangyari. So with my recommendation earlier about mainstream media having an intensive research, which is highly suggested also for local filmmakers, Kasi there are some who are not also fully exposed that they might also create, they themselves might create a misrepresentation of their own culture. So notably, understanding the culture or where you really belong is also an important factor.
Right. Okay, so thank you. All right, let's move on to the next. Medyo dumadaming tanong. Ayan. So this, I think you'll be able to see this in the chat box. Thank you for the presentation. So this is from Jeremiah Paul Silvestre. May I ask if there were attempts to communicate the results of the study to the indigenous cultural communities, so Aita and Kankanay? I am interested if they are aware of the misrepresentations or if these misrepresentations were validated by them. I might have missed it, but maybe hearing them out on how they can be culturally appropriately represented can be surfaced from there too. So, ayan. No? So, first is na communicate daw po ba ang results ng inyong study? And after that, dialogue perhaps or yung pagbalik sa community, were they aware of the misrepresentations? Na-validate daw ba? Ayan. Punta naman tayo kay Mr. Dalokdok. Yan, reverse naman. Okay. Baka gusto
Yeah,
mo.
sige, with ano yung isang validation, tama. They are aware because during data gathering process, I mentioned some concepts and they did not agree to mainstream representation. So since they are also exposed to mainstream media, alam nila yan. And regarding to communicating this, the result of these papers to the community, I think there's on my end from personal perspective, aside from returning or giving this to some LGUs to copy of my research, we were then planning to, in collaboration with local film producers, to in some ways elevate the local film industry. Pero nagko-COVID, so hindi siya natuloy. So the one of my colleague from the department is working with this local film industry, with this local film producers to promote their films. So I think it's still on process or under construction.
Right. Let's listen. Okay, Ms. Sulit.
Same din po with my co-presenter. When I interviewed them, they actually know the misrepresentations being done by the mainstream media. That's why they are being pushed talaga to create films about them. Kasi wala silang makitang semblance of them in mainstream media. And then one of the things that I actually discovered during the interview was they don't really subscribe much to the local film, mainstream film industry. They would rather look at K-dramas to pattern their narratives with or yung kanilang flow ng pagkukwento instead of the fast-paced stories from Manila na usually Hollywood-inspired din po. As for the results, I was able to share my paper to Sir Clemente and Sir Paulino, and then they were able to share it then with their film community. So far, yun pa lang po yung parang sharing na nagagawa namin. But during our talks, nung interview, they are actually passionate to create more films. It's just that yun nga, nagka-pandemic, and then they are looking actually for funders or sponsors dun sa mga films na gagawin nila. And then I tried to redirect them with NCCA because there is a fund grant from NCCA. Hindi ko lang po sure kung paano na-process po nila yung application. So siguro po in the next months yun po baka matrabaho din po namin yun so that they can create pa rin during the pandemic.
Okay. All right. So thank you for your answers. All right. There's another question here directly sent to us. Okay. So it says, okay, thank you for your presentations. They were informative. When an outsider depicts indigenous peoples, more often than not, their depiction is criticized as biased, uninformed, or derogatory. But when an indigenous person illustrates the lives of indigenous peoples, we accept the representations as valid, close to reality, and informed. objectively speaking, if both portray the same images of Indigenous peoples without correcting the misrepresentations, there isn't really much of a difference. Okay? With that said, is Indigenous representation necessarily more legitimate or truer if the one doing the representation is Indigenous? Okay? Right? So with that said, is Indigenous representation necessarily more legitimate or truer if the one doing the representation is Indigenous? Okay. So maybe let's hear from, you want to go first, Sulit? Ayan.
Okay po. Actually, it was mentioned doon sa Fort Cinema wherein um, iba pa rin talaga yung magiging pagtingin ng Indigenous people sa sarili nila instead of an outsider looking inside. Because of course, yun nga, as mentioned earlier, even some of our filmmakers will suffer showing misrepresentation of their own Indigenous people's groups. Alam natin na yun nga, probably yung mga values na yun ay na-romanticize na kasi by the mainstream media. So I'm not really saying na parang 100% legitimate talaga compared to the people compared to outsider people no nagagawa ng films yung mga pelikula. It's just that pag inugat natin yung kung saan yung pinanggagalingan ng mga Indigenous peoples themselves in creating their films, we would know na parang for the last 100 years of cinema, ito kasi yung pinupukol sa kanila and hindi talaga maiiwasan na magkakaroon ng maroromanticize yung kanilang image na somehow even themselves ay na-embrace din nila. So, yun yung for me, that's the difference of an Indigenous people's filmmaker compared to an outsider creating a film on Indigenous people. So, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think yung position kasi ng, let's say, the one who creates the film or the producer is the local, no? And then usually audience din naman ng local films kasi local, no? So if there might be representations, there are always avenues to be corrected. Or it is just a parcel of, it's a parcel of, or a snapshot of the real one. So parang ganun, no? So kung locals din naman ang nanonood, they would understand kung bakit ganun ang case, no? And I think the position is also valid that how about pag lumabas yung itong film na iba? So I think that's also one thing that has to be considered. Pero for me, if locals, as noted, locals themselves are more sincere or knows more of the culture that they are attempting to represent as compared to an outsider.
Right. Okay. So, I hope kung meron kang gustong follow-up question dyan sa mga nauna nang nagtanong, okay, may oras pa naman tayo. We still have about 6 minutes. Ayan. Right? So, maybe we can, maybe one last question. Okay, kung meron pang gustong kumabol.
While waiting siguro, let me just add, in terms of the protection of the local film industry with the locals themselves, I think this has also needs to be done by the filmmakers. They have to register their own, what they call this, they developed actually an organization to protect or to help them promoting their crafts and protect their films. But as of the research when we were doing the study, their organization is not yet fully registered. So if your organization is not fully registered yet, there is really a difficulty in securing funding and other grants from non-government organizations so that the training that they're looking for shall be granted. I believe or I hope that after the pandemic, they're able to fix this also.
Okay. So, all right. So, perhaps this ends our session. So, nakita natin sa presentations as well as sa mga discussion na nangganap, no, sa mga tanong na naibigay ng ating mga participants, no, that maraming prospects, no, na pwede pang magawa, no, dito sa ganitong ganitong pinipursue, no, na orientation with respect to how we produce, create films, no. At the same time, no, maraming may prospects pero andun yung challenges. So ang challenges based on your presentations and yung mga sagot nyo rin kanina sa mga tanong, pwedeng ang isa sa, of course, no, challenge is really the content, no? Kung ano yung ilalabas, no, sa mga film. But at the same time, itong challenge na magkaroon ng accurate representation, no, sa film ay practical din, no, yung mga challenges. So these are things that we need to address, no, kung gusto nating mas i-push pa, no, ipagpatuloy or reinforce nga, no, na magkaroon pa ng local films produced by specific indigenous groups themselves. All right. Okay, so with that, of course, thank you so much to our panel speakers and of course the active participation of the attendees, no? Hindi po mabubuo at magmamaterialize ang session ito kung wala kayo. Ayan.